Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive into behavioral questions, leadership questions, whatever you want to call them, the questions that test your soft skills as an engineer. That many engineers do not prepare enough for these questions. Mark is here to explain exactly how you need to prepare for them and what you can do to ace them. Mark, we were saying earlier that some engineers kind of think they can blag these questions. That's not a recommended approach.
Yeah, I think that being intentional is really important. So planning and preparing is worthwhile, pays off.
Okay, when you're ready, what's the first thing that you want to talk about?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to kind of share maybe or think about is the notion of timing. Thinking about time. One of the hard parts about interviews, and especially the leadership and behavioral interviews, they're often say 45 minutes scheduled. So in reality, you might have 40 minutes. And so being recognizing the fact that you have this artificially compressed time frame means you need to be efficient with your responses and what you're sharing during the interview. And so if you do some really rough math, you could say, hey, 10 questions maybe the interviewer has. So 40 minutes, 10 questions, 4 minutes each. Maybe you have 3.5 minutes or so to speak. And of course, that's just an average. And some questions might be much shorter. Like you could have some introductory or warm up questions. They might just be a minute. And then there might be some longer story questions where you're telling a really in depth, interesting, exciting story. And that might take a little bit longer. But just be sort of thinking about that sort of timing is, I think, an important component of these interviews.
Yeah, definitely. And I wonder, it's probably right. Imagine you're a couple of questions in and you're not quite sure whether you're being too concise or too long-winded. You could probably just ask the interviewer, just say, "Hey, by the way, am I being too detailed in my answers here?" And they'd probably give you a steer on that, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on the interviewer, and that's actually a good
Right.
point you're raising, which is the interviewer, the person who's interviewing you, is actually that's going to change how you might approach things. So if I'm in a position of interviewing, knowing who the person is can be super valuable. If I do know who's going to be interviewing me, and I wouldn't be afraid to ask a recruiter to give me as much information as they can. If I know who the person is, I might look them up on LinkedIn. I might look at GitHub commit comments just to see what's their style, how do they interact, what is their role? Are they a senior product manager? Are they a staff engineer? Are they a director? What is their place in the company? Are they at a large company where they might be interviewing many people over the course of a week, or is it more of a startup and you're interviewing with the actual potential hiring manager or someone who'd be reporting to you or be a peer? So that can, I think, make a difference. And then the communication style. And so I think getting back to your point about could you just ask the interviewer? Some interviewers are going to be open to that, and you might notice that in your first impressions as you talk to them. Are they jovial or are they a little bit more informal in their communication? Uh, and then it might be okay to say, hey, help me, as we go through this, just let me know if you want more information from me, or if going on a little bit too long, I can adjust as needed. I think that's okay. I think in general, it's probably better to kind of gauge that yourself if you can,
Okay.
and read
Yeah.
the interviewer. Use your skills to watch the interviewer for nonverbal cues to the extent that you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah. I guess that's part of communication skill is being able to read people's reactions and
Yeah,
adapt accordingly. Yeah. And so
yeah,
because I think we were chatting about this before, and you were saying you can kind of match your tone to the interviewer, right? So if you have an interviewer that's kind of jovial and maybe informal, and you can kind of adapt to that vibe. And if they're a bit more straight to the point and a bit more serious, then you can kind of try and match that a little bit.
yeah, and of course, I think that I would naturally do that
Yeah.
just because I want to connect with the interviewer. But I mean, I don't think you have to go crazy doing that. I think it's don't change who you are.
Okay.
Isn't that's not
Yeah.
the
Right.
message here?
Yeah.
Don't change your style completely. But if the to your point, if the interviewer is a little bit more to the point, maybe your responses are a little bit more concise, a little bit more to the point. Maybe you'll leave out a detail or something like
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
I think this is though, those are maybe some details. I think there's some other big things that would be useful to think about. So I don't know if you're okay. I can talk a little bit about the other aspects that the interviewer maybe is looking for, if that's useful.
Yeah. Let's get into that. Yeah.
So, and the other thing I want to acknowledge before I get to that is that many of the clients that I've helped and even candidates, of course, are often on the interviewer side of things. So they interview a lot of people. I'm coaching engineering manager or director candidates, and they
Right.
interview lots and lots of people. But being on the other side of that interview is a very different experience.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that I think you can do, or candidates can do, is in the interview, think about yourself. If you were the interviewer, what would be the things that you would be looking for from this candidate? What are the signals that you're looking for? And signals can be things like learning or a growth mindset, or the stories or the experiences that you're sharing giving me a signal that you are constantly growing or that you're learning things versus a fixed mindset. For example, that could be a signal. A level of humility. Are you willing to admit mistakes? Truly admit mistakes and
Yeah.
take responsibility for them. Balancing business and people aspects. Having principles around your approaches. Using things like, so I think I talk a lot about tools. I think about leadership as a tool belt that you kind of develop over time. And so things like failure can actually be a tool that you use. Time
Yeah.
can be a tool. So time boxing is often a term that I've heard used. And if I talk about that as a tool, as something that you actually utilize in your work, then that gives me a signal as the interviewer that you are using time not just as deadlines, but you're using it as a way to get things done and manage your team and manage people and help people collaboratively deliver something awesome. So, and there's a bunch of other signals that you could probably figure out yourself. But I think that notion of putting yourself in the mindset of the interviewer, if you are interviewing yourself, can help you, I think, get a little bit of perspective. What is the interviewer after? What are the signals they're looking for?
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so we've talked briefly about timing. We've talked about how to kind of think a little bit about what the interviewer is looking for, and adapt slightly to that, and make sure your answers kind of hit those things that they're looking for. Is there anything else before we get kind of into the nitty gritty of it? Anything else that you want to pull up on these kind of areas?
I've gotten from lots of clients and candidates this sort of imposter syndrome, which is very common. And one of the things that you might feel as a candidate is, wow, these interviews are really tough, and I really don't feel like I'm doing so well. And you start questioning your ability to do your job. And
Right.
I just want to give
Yeah.
people, reassure you, interviews are a very different beast. They don't reflect directly on what you're doing at your job, which you're obviously doing successfully. Otherwise, you wouldn't be there. So, just want to give people, give yourself a little bit of grace. Take it easy on yourself, and that's throughout this process.
Let's crack on to the next
Let's keep
section.
going.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about strategies in responding to questions. So questions that interviewers ask. Interviewers will have questions that they have calibrated on, and that by which I mean they have built those questions up over time. They have kind of an idea of the space of responses that might be in that realm. And I'm being very vague here, so I should just maybe use an example, like saying, "What's your approach to leadership?" And that's a very wide open,
Yeah.
big question. And so one
Yeah.
of the things that you can do as a candidate is, I think it's perfectly fine if you get a question that is open-ended, or you feel like is pretty big in scope. It's okay to get clarification from the interviewer to say, okay, well, tell me what you mean by leadership. That's a pretty big topic. Do you have any more constraints or context on that? What you're looking for there? That's a totally reasonable thing to do. I would consider that kind of an opt-in approach, where by opt-in I mean that you ask the interviewer for more information or for something, and then they opt in to giving you that information. Another approach that you could do is, if the person again asks that same question, what's your approach to leadership? One of the ways you could approach that is by using a more of an opt-out approach, which would be stating an assumption or scoping down what that means and then answering it. So saying, for example, okay, well, leadership is a pretty big topic. Why don't I talk to you about some of my principles that I utilize that are really important to me? I'll tell you about 3 principles that are important to me when I am in a leadership role, and I'm helping teams move forward. So let me talk to you about those, if that's okay. So what I've just
Yeah.
done is I've proposed something that I'm going to do, and I've proposed a little bit more scope around this, or reduce the scope a little bit. And if the interviewer feels like that's not what they were looking for, they can jump in,
Yeah.
and they can say, well, actually, that's not exactly what I'm asking. Let me try and clarify. Or they'll say, okay, sounds good. right? So this opt out and opt in approach is a balance of those two approaches. If you need to reduce the scope or get a little bit more constraints around the particular question, I think is totally fine.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like politicians would do well in these interviews because they're kind of always good at answering the questions that they want to be asked rather than
Yeah.
the actual
Well,
question.
I'm not going to touch that one, but yeah, fair enough. So another thing, of course, that happens just in general with questions is that there's going to be questions that you can prepare for, and we'll get to those. But there's also going to be lots of questions that you probably haven't heard before, and so or you don't feel very well prepared for. And one of the things that can be awkward for people is silence. And I want to say that it is even awkward for me to have a moment of silence. However, one of the things that is actually a positive signal to an interviewer, I think, is if there's a question that I feel, for example, I'm the candidate and I get a question that I don't feel very well prepared for, it's okay, I think, for me to say, give me just a moment to think about that. That's a really good question. I just want to take a moment to put together my response here. And even if I need to write some notes on a piece of paper or something, and there's now 20 seconds, gosh forbid, 30 seconds of silence, that's still totally fine. And as a matter of fact, it gives the interviewer a signal that this person is being thoughtful and intentional about their responses. Now, you don't want to do that on every question. That's not what I'm saying here, but there may be opportunities where you think you would benefit from just a moment of thought before you respond, and that provides this signal of intentionality, which I think is really good.
Absolutely, yeah. And just by simply saying that, you're suddenly kind of taking the awkwardness out of it, aren't you? Like if you say, I'm just going to collect my thoughts for a minute, if that's okay, and then the 30 seconds of silence is not awkward, whereas if you do it without saying that, then it is.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point, Tom. I think setting expectations with the interviewer is, I guess, maybe a comment here. And if you say that, then you're setting expectations with the interviewers. So I think that's a good way to do it.
Nice.
Okay, so moving on. So one of the other things that I'll say is identifying a category of question. And I'm going to say here, category of question sounds really very formalized and super structured. And I have sort of adopted this framework, I'll call it maybe 3 categories of questions that I don't think is just prescriptive. I don't think it's definitive, but I think it is a way to create some structure around these soft skill, kind of vague, kind of non-technical question domains. And I think some structure can help, especially people with an engineering mindset, do a better job at responding and thinking about the questions. So I like to think of 3 different categories of questions. I'm going to get into those in just a moment. I'll mention them really briefly. There's sort of stories, which you can absolutely prepare for, skill set questions, and scenario-based questions, which are more sort of hypothetical. And with these 3 categories in mind, not every question is going to fit neatly into any one of these categories, but again, it can help you just kind of figure out how to respond and how to phrase your response, how to formulate your response. And one of the common recommendations, I would say, maybe across these categories of questions, is to try to stick to the category of question unless you get the okay from the interviewer to change. So what I mean by that is if the interviewer asks you to tell a story and you start talking in generalities about principles, then what you're doing is you're kind of, without checking with the interviewer, you're changing the type of question, you're changing what their space of answers that they're thinking about. They're looking for a story. They're looking for you to tell about an experience in your career, and you're talking in generalities. That creates cognitive dissonance. You don't want that. So you want to try and stay in the space of the question as best you can. And if you feel strongly that you need to switch, then just ask the interviewer. If the interviewer asks you a general question, what's your take on leadership, or what's your approach to leadership? And you say, well, I actually have a really good story to tell you about that can illustrate that. Is that okay? You're using the opt-in approach, which I mentioned earlier, to check with the interviewer. And if the interviewer then can make the choice, do they want to hear the story, switch gears, hear the story from you, or do they want you to continue talking about sort of your principled approaches? So that would be sort of my high level comment there. We will get into more details in those categories of questions because I think it's important to kind of describe a little bit more what I mean by those. Yeah, and just as a as a counter example to my own framework or notion idea here, I just got the other day. I had a client who said, "Yeah, I got this question from an interviewer that said." How do you manage people? Can you tell me an example? So they got like two questions in one,
Right.
and
Yeah.
that may happen. May
Mm.
happen. That's a great opportunity to ask them to clarify or to make an assumption, either an opt-in or an opt-out approach to scoping down the question or choosing one. So I think that
Yeah.
will happen. Interviews are human too.
Sure.
Okay, so we've talked about opt-in, opt-out. We've talked about categories of questions. I want to the one other thing is that sometimes, especially I would say in the context of stories, it can come up, and maybe I'll get into that. But sometimes it's useful if you get a particular question to give a super short intro that is maybe not exactly that type of question. So this is kind of sounds counter to what I was just saying. Stick to the question. But if you have 3 minutes on average, 3.5 minutes
Mm-hmm.
to answer a question, respond to a question, and the interviewer, again, I'm going to use that same example. What's your approach to leadership? And I wouldn't want to my earlier comment, I wouldn't want to just go straight into a big long story, but I might say, I definitely have some principled approach to leadership. And I want to talk to you about that. But I want to just let you know, just the other day, I actually had a situation where my leadership skills were in question. And so that was somebody where I messed up or whatever. It could be a very, very short anecdote, just a super, super short little comment, and then move on to the meat of the main part of your response. So I think that's okay to do, and I can illustrate that a little bit more if it's useful.
Okay.
Okay.
And the benefit of doing that is just to kind of, I guess it helps show that you are a real person actually like dealing with these things in your day to day, and you're not just someone who's learned a script kind of thing. Like it helps kind of position your answers maybe in the real world. Or what's your reason for doing that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And of course, I used that particular example, which I actually don't think was a great example that I used, but in that scenario or example that I described, I think you're absolutely right. Like that's a good way to give the interviewer a little bit of a signal that, oh yeah, I'm a real person, and these leadership principles that I'm about to talk to you about, they actually they show up all the time for me. I'm actually
Yeah.
utilizing these day to day. So that could be that signal that you're maybe giving that I'm really applying these things. Could be that. In a slightly different question, if, for example, you get asked a question, tell me about a time that you had to deal with an underperformer on your team.
Yeah.
In that particular case, it's specifically an example question. And I definitely then want to respond with a story, with an example. However, what I might do is I might just say initially, well, underperformance is a pretty complicated topic and it's a very individualized situation. There's no one size fits all. So I actually have different approaches depending on the situation. And if someone is, for example, been a strong performer for a long time, is now underperforming, that might be different than someone who just joined the team and just hasn't performed coming into the team. Let me tell you about a situation where I had someone who was a strong performer for a long time and all of a sudden had a drop off in their performance. So what I've just done
Nice.
is I've spent maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I didn't time it,
Okay.
giving the interviewer a little bit of my principles, but just a tiny amount, and then I'm going to go into the main story. And what that does, to your question about what does that do for you, is it's almost like gives you two for one, gives the
Yeah.
interviewer a
Yeah.
signal that you actually have a breadth of experience in this particular space,
Yeah.
and you're aware that this is not one thing, but you're also going to then get into a real situation. So I think that's where those short little intros can be useful, but they need to be short. It's
Yeah.
really, really tempting, and it's very easy to then have those things go on and on and on. So
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah. I think that's a great
I'll stop
example.
there.
But yeah. All right. Cool.
Okay, so let's get into, if it's okay, let's get into categories of questions.
Let's do it. What's the first
All right.
category that we're gonna take
Yeah.
on?
So as a reminder, right? So there's, again, this is my sort of framework that I'm just using as a way to help structure. So the three categories that I think about are story questions, which are things like, give me an example, tell me about a time when, when was the last time you, those kinds of questions. Skill set questions, which is the second category, and that's more things like, how do you approach leadership? Again, what's your approach to leadership? Uh, what are the main characteristics that you expect from your direct reports? Something like that. These are sort of more generic questions, or skill set slash tool belt questions. And then the third thing again is scenarios. And scenarios, Google likes to do these, I think maybe more than other companies. I'm not sure why, which is hypothetical questions. Things like, assume that you have a peer manager who's left abruptly, and the team that is left behind is now yours. You've been charged with taking on that team. The morale is low. They're behind in delivery. How would you approach this? What would you do to deal with this? How would you deal with X, Y, Z? So they're hypothetical questions. And in those types of questions, it's the term that I've heard actually a client used. I thought it was brilliant. Was system design for people or system design for teams. So it's a little bit in that space where there's not a fixed solution, but it's a system design. Okay, so stories, skill sets, scenarios. So why don't we start with stories? Those are the most common types of questions. And the thing I love about stories is those are the things that you as a candidate can prepare for the most, because they're yours. They're completely yours. There's no question about about it. It's your stories, so you get to shape them any which way you want to.
And
so
a lot of people,
examples. Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of people would call these behavioral questions, right? Because they're
okay.
I mean, the terminology is always different, but yeah, we would on our blog we usually refer to these as behavioral questions. It's looking at their past behavior to predict future behavior. So carry on. Yeah, these are all you can prepare for them. You've done it all, so it's just about doing that work and thinking about your past and preparing those stories, right?
Yeah, and so I think absolutely. So the example. Let me give you some examples, maybe that might help this that I've think about. So common things I've heard and I've asked sometimes people is, tell me about a mistake you've made. That's a story question. Tell me about a time where you demonstrated leadership even though you weren't in a leadership position. So one of the things that I think is conflated in the space of leadership often is the title or authority with the behavior or leadership behavior. Even if you are just a mere software engineer or individual contributor, let's just say, you can exhibit leadership behaviors. And so this question is sort of asking, basically, tell me about a time where you stepped up and took the lead, even though you're not a tech lead or a manager or whatever. So that's behind that, but that's another example. One more example might be, tell me about a time you led a team through a difficult situation. So that could be, so all of these are kind of these story questions. And so with these story questions, part of the thing that is important, I think, for people to think about as they're thinking about their stories is you want these stories to be interesting. And so by interesting, I mean that they're often messy. They're often time consuming. They have imperfect outcomes, but hopefully better outcomes in the end if there's a challenge. That usually they're around challenges. And so another way to say that is, let me use an anti-pattern or an anti-example. If I get the question about, tell me about a time when you had a difficult person, you had to deal with a difficult person. And I say, well, I had a person who sent an email that was inappropriate to the team. So I talked to them about it and they apologized and then they didn't do that again. That is not an interesting story. That is a transaction. That shows me very little about your leadership abilities. So when I say messy and interesting, often it takes, like I said, it takes time. It could be behavior that needs to change over time where, okay, this person, I can use the same example, this person who sent an inappropriate email, I talked to them and they continued to do that. And so I had to kind of sit down with them and really understand what's going on here, what's behind this. And I had to really explain to them, show them examples of better ways to maybe communicate. And then what we did was we met in our regular meetings. We touched on this topic and I tried to give them feedback. And they're better now. They're still not perfect, but they're better at doing that. They're at least, they will now check in with me occasionally if they think they might be sending. So I'm just giving you an example that is not real, but that's a more interesting story because it means that I had to get creative as a person in a leadership situation, and I had to continue working on this. And I had to understand the person, and I had to coach them. And so on. So that's much more interesting, much more of an interesting story. So think about that that aspect when you're choosing your stories, that you want something that is interesting and possibly messy. In terms of the both the process of getting through it and maybe even the outcome. So I'm not sure if that's useful, but
Yeah,
that's
that's
kind of how I think
useful.
about it.
It's,
That's kind of how I think
I
about
mean,
it.
it's in storytelling. Like generally, people always say that there has to be a conflict, right? There has to be in every kind of film and book. There's always like something that the hero has to overcome.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna be the hero in your interview, you have to make the thing that you overcome worth it, right? So yeah, don't make it too easy. I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of stories, so let's say that you have a couple of stories. I think it's useful to build your inventory of stories. The inventory is sort of the set of stories that you're preparing that you feel that you can practice, and you can if you need to use a stopwatch when you're practicing, absolutely do it. I'm not a big fan of using a stopwatch during the actual interview because I find it distracting. Some people might find it useful, but in any case, the stories that you select and that you work on and you build your inventory around, I think it's worth practicing those, writing them down, and doing them out loud because you're going to be
Yeah.
speaking them. You don't want them to be a script. You're not reading off of a script, but you want to have some highlighted points. These are the points that I'm trying to get across. So I recommend people doing that because again, you are in control of these stories. You can figure this out. And of course, in the context of writing these down, and kind of back to your point about in every movie, book, whatever, there's got to be sort of I'm going to use the term story arc. Maybe that's not what you used, but there's different models, and I think you have one, but I think the one that I've heard very frequently is the STAR method. Situation. Gosh, now I'm drawing a
Ta-
blank on the acronym.
task. Is it
Task, thank
task
you. Which
or
which
yeah?
often is also responsibility, like what's your role? So situation,
Yeah.
task, and then action and result. And so the STAR method, which is pretty common and pretty widely used. I've also heard plus plus used, which the plus plus is sort of a lesson learned. So if coming out of this story that you're telling, this experience, if there's something that you learned that is valuable to share with the interviewer, then do that, and don't wait for the interviewer to ask you. Go ahead and provide it. Now, not every story is going to have a lesson learned, but if you do have one that you think is valuable, go ahead and share it. But I think you told me in a conversation that there's also a model that IGotAnOffer's used, right?
Yeah, I got an offer. I think we created it. It's not as catchy as Star. We call it the SIPSIL method. So
Mm-hmm.
solution, problem, situation, problem, solution, impact, and then lessons.
Lesson. Okay,
So
so
basically,
yeah,
because Star, I think lessons are important, and Star completely like forgets about them, or it's easy. Even if you're kind of doing Star plus plus, you might forget what the plus is for. So yeah, SIPSIL is what we use or we recommend on our blogs, and yeah, I think it works, but yeah, not super catchy. But I think the important thing, right, is to have a structure,
yes.
whatever it is.
Yes, I think that's spot on. And again, I would say that especially in the technical space where we as engineers are trained to problem solve and to structure things and to break things down. I think having some sort of structure can be super useful. There is no perfect structure. There's not one structure, but pick one and just kind of use it and try it out. And I would say if that doesn't work, if like the star plus plus doesn't resonate as well as SIPSIL, then use SIPSIL. I don't want to
Yeah,
push a
whatever
particular one.
works.
I think you're absolutely
Yeah.
right that picking a structure and having one is useful. Okay, so once you have these inventory of stories and you've kind of touched on these things. And by the way, the other thing to this structure that we're just talking about, it should not be a checklist, right? Yeah, just to be clear, like if you're structuring your story, you're not going to be in the interview saying, okay, let me tell you about the the situation. Let me tell you about the task, right? You're not going to be doing that, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just more important to keep that you want to touch on those things, in your story. I think that's maybe the key there.
Yeah,
Okay.
don't be too rigid about it. Maybe yeah,
Yeah,
just use it to
exactly.
help you, but don't be
Yeah,
forced. Don't feel
yeah,
forced by it. Yeah.
yeah. That's right. Okay, so the one other comment I want to make, well, there's a couple more. A comment I want to make about stories. One of the cool things about stories, again, you control them yourself. You get to choose what these are. It is totally valid and I think actually even useful. It's a feature that stories can be multi-purpose. So What do I mean by that? If you have a story about a person on your team that had maybe communication issues or something like that, and maybe this was a tough thing, tough, problematic enough that it caused productivity issues or something on the team, and you helped work through that somehow, or make progress on that. That could be show up. You could utilize that story possibly in the context of a question about, tell me about a time when you had to deal with a performance underperformer. That could be an underperformer story. Tell me about a time when you had to resolve conflict between people. That could be you could focus that on conflict. It could be, tell me about a tough management challenge that you had. Right? You could utilize this, and so I think
Yeah.
it's useful
Yeah.
to think about the stories as multi-purpose, and you might have to shape them slightly differently as you tell them. But I wouldn't want to over prepare for that a little bit. But I think just realizing that your story isn't just for one question. You can, these stories can be multi-purpose. That's really
Yep. Yep.
the point there.
I think that's really helpful. Otherwise, you're going to end up having kind of 30 different stories, and it'll take you forever to prepare, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So the other comment I would make, and this is probably, some of these things I'm saying are not that enlightened or anything, or that amazing, or kind of obvious or common sense, but I'll point them out. One of them is, I think you don't want to use the same story multiple times, especially in one interview session. Especially in these contexts of these leadership questions, one of the signals that an interviewer is looking for is your breadth of experience and the fact that you have multiple experiences in different areas. If you wind up in the 20 minutes into the interview and you say, well, getting back to my story that I told you earlier, in that situation, and you start telling that, the signal that I start to get as an interviewer is this the only experience that you've had? Are you basing everything based on this one scenario? That's not what you want. That's not the signal you want. So I would recommend, especially in a single interview, avoid using the same story twice. That could be difficult. That could mean that you've already used up a story in an earlier question, and you'd like to use it now, but you probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
And so that can be difficult. But I think that's better than to repeat yourself. I've had people, and when I was interviewing myself, I have had people use the same response in a different interview with a different interviewer for the same position.
Right.
I'm not as caught up on that, as long as if I'm the candidate and I'm talking to my second interviewer or third interviewer or whatever it is, and I get a question, they say, well, that question, I already kind of talked about that with the previous interviewer. I can still tell you about it, but I just want to let you know that I think I've already covered some of that. Up to you, right? Then at least you're giving the interviewer the signal that you're aware that this is maybe a repeat of some sort, and that you might be saying something that's already been said. That's better, and that's yeah.
They find.
Go ahead.
How did you find out? Like, so the interviewers talk to each other, then they share. Kind
Great
of
question.
Or...
Great question.
Without wanting to divert you, yeah.
We could do a whole video on how interviewing works in different companies, but a common thing that I've is pretty a common approach interviewing, especially in large companies, is to have interviewers be a pool of interviewers. So they're not necessarily going to be you wouldn't be working with them necessarily, but they interview lots and lots of people. And what they do is they write up their interview feedback, and then that in that interview feedback goes to a hiring committee. And that hiring committee looks at all of the interview feedback and then makes a recommendation based on that. And if my interview feedback says, the candidate mentioned they'd already answered this question before in a previous interview, and that goes into my written notes, and I'm likely to put that in, I should, then the hiring committee can see, even if the candidate answered with the same thing, they can see that they're at least aware of that. So that's how that might show up.
Okay. I see. So, yeah, that makes sense. I didn't realize it was all kind of written down so much that they're actually going to record kind of notes on your actual story. So, no hiding.
No hiding. Well, I think companies have worked very hard and very diligently at trying to reduce bias. And I really say trying, putting effort into reduce bias when it comes to hiring and interviewing. And you can't remove it because we're humans, but you can try to reduce it. And one way to reduce it is to have the interviewers independently write up their feedback without talking to each other. So you're actually discouraged from talking to each other about a candidate.
Yeah.
And there's actually been times when I've been in a hallway with somebody. Oh yeah, did you talk to that person? I said, yeah. Well, I haven't written up my feedback yet, so I don't want to talk to you about that. So I think the companies try to do a pretty good, decent job of reducing that. Okay. One last thing I want to say about story questions. There will be times, and it depends on your experience level. If you're applying, for example, for a management role, and you've only been a manager for a couple of years, and you get asked a story question or experiential question, like, tell me about a time when you had to deal with work through layoffs, or you had to manage through layoffs, and there's a chance that you haven't experienced that.
Yep.
That's totally okay. You don't make stuff up. Nobody expects you to have all the experiences possible. If you either don't have an experience, or you feel like you're not prepared well enough, or the story that you do have maybe isn't good enough, one of the things you can do is you can stop. You can say, I just haven't had that experience. Sorry. I think a better thing to do is to say, so I haven't had that experience yet, but I have been through, I'm using that example again, I have certainly seen layoffs, and I can talk to you about what I might do if I were in that situation where I had to be in a leadership position or management position and work through layoffs. Based on my experience, I can talk you through my approach that I might take based on what I've seen and what I've gathered and how I might do it. So offering, this is again the opt-in approach, you're offering to the interviewer to change essentially the question from a storytelling question, because you don't have a story, to a hypothetical scenario that you would be describing. And so let the interviewer decide. And if the interviewers, they may say, oh yeah, sure, talk me through it. How might you approach this? Great. Now they're on board, right? They might say, well, no, actually, that's okay. Let's just move on to another question. That's totally fine as well. Yeah. So that's an opportunity, I guess, is because I do get candidates that say, oh my gosh, what if I don't have a story? Well, then you probably still can kind of, it's like a little bit, again, it's like a little mini system design question, but for an organizational system design question.
Yeah. Okay. Like that. Cool. Are we done on stories? Can we move on to the next category of questions?
I think so. Let's move on if it's okay with you. Yeah.
Let's do it.
So, all right. So the second category, the first one we finished stories. The second category is what I would call skill sets. Let me give you a couple of examples there. I think I've already mentioned a few, but just to refresh here. So one might be, what's your approach to managing engineers for engineering managers? Or how do you deal with underperformers? What signals do you look for in order to know when to get hands-on? That could be for a tech lead too, or it could be for a senior engineer, or it could be for a peer that's trying to help. So these are sort of more general questions. These are more about, and again, I'll use the term tool belt. I think of these questions as asking about your tool belt as a leader. You've developed, adopted tools over time that have helped you be successful in your role, and you've possibly changed those, tweaked those, tuned those, maybe based on some experiences you've had, back to that plus or learning at the end of the SIPSL. So if you're adjusting this tool belt over time and developing it, and so that's what these questions are about, is about this tool belt. And so what do I mean by tool belt? So a question like, what's your approach to managing engineers? What I'm looking for as an interviewer, what I'm interested in is, I'm interested in key principles that are important to you, your values, your best practices, your habits, your maybe even some fundamental cultural principles that you have. And so that's kind of a very different, of course, space than stories, because here you're not going to tell a story, you're going to talk about your general approaches. And in this type of question, if you get that question, like I mentioned, what's your approach to leadership? You feel free to get clarification, opt in or scope it down, opt out. You should absolutely feel free to do that. Okay, so let's say you've got you know the scope of what you want to talk about, and if it's a new question that you haven't heard, you've taken a moment, if you need to collect your thoughts, that's totally fine. And now I'm gonna give a number, which I like to tell people. I highlight 3 tools, And so I use 3, and this is, again, I don't want this to be too prescriptive, right? But pick 3, just 3 is a good number. 3 tools that you use that are important to you, values, principles, tools, habits, best practices that are important to you, that you utilize in your work, and give me an outline of those first. Tell me what those things are, then provide details. So this is back to the comment about setting expectations with the interviewer. If I'm the interviewer, one of the things, if I ask an open question like what's your approach to leadership, or how do you manage engineers? That is such a big question, even for me as an interviewer, that it's possible that the candidate might go down so many holes. Oh, and the other thing. Oh, and this other thing. And so I don't know when you're done. So setting expectations and kind of structuring your response a little bit can really help set expectations with me as the interviewer. And I know now what to expect when you're done. So, for example, if I get the question about what's your approach to managing engineers, and I say, well, there's 3 things that are really important to me. Really honest, frank communication is really important to me. Psychological safety, so the people can share what they, what their opinions are, is really important to me. And then proactive communication. It's kind of sub aspect of communication, but I want to talk about it separately. So really open, honest communication, feedback, psychological safety, and proactive communication. Let me tell you more about those. Okay, so now what you've just done is you've given me sort of a little bit of an outline of what to expect. It's like the table of contents or something. I hate to use that term, but
Yeah.
so right. And so now when for each one of those, so I might then go deeper on each one of those. I might talk about this sort of honest communication. Maybe I'll use what is it called? Candid. Radical candor. That's the word I'm looking. That's the term I'm looking for. Maybe that's a principle that I really like. So I talk about that. And so referencing industry best practices is fine, makes sense. If you can describe how you apply them. So if you just use the buzzwords like the Amazon leadership principles or Project Oxygen or psychological safety, and you just leave it at that, it's like, yeah, I could have read that in a textbook. There's nothing special about that. That does not set you apart as a candidate at all. But if you tell me psychological safety is really important to me, and so one of the aspects of psychological safety is being vulnerable, and it means showing that it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to share your opinion. So one of the things that I wind up doing is in meetings, in our biweekly team meetings, I wind up thinking about, is there something that I made a mistake on since we last met? And if there is, I say, hey, folks, I made a mistake. I made an incorrect assumption about this. That was my mistake. So I apologize that we spent a little bit more time on this aspect than we shouldn't have. Let's get back on track. So apologies, but that was my mistake. Let's move on. Right. And so what I'm doing then by doing that is I'm leading by example, showing that it's okay. And over time, it takes time for people to kind of get the sense that that's okay to do. But that's why psychological safety is important to me, because then people can admit to mistakes and we can move on and we can correct things. So that little description that I just gave is kind of a little bit of a deep dive on psychological safety, and not the textbook the abstract definition of it, but how it's important to me and how I implement it. That's what I want to hear. I want to hear how this meets the real world, not just that you know about the best practices. So that's
really like that.
That's kind of an important thing.
Nice. Yeah, really like that example. Cool.
Okay. So the other aspect of this, and this is kind of back to my comment about stick with the category of question that's being asked. In this type category of question, this was the how do you manage your engineers, and I'm talking about these principles. It can be tempting that if I talk about like that psychological safety example that I just gave, it can be tempting for me to delve into a long story, like a full story about psychological safety, and spend the remaining 2.5 minutes of my response talking about an example. Don't do that. Short anecdotes to illustrate the principle is great, but this is not a story question. I don't want to. I'm asking about the general principles and values and so on. So now you can offer a really short version, again checking with the interviewer, but just realize time here. Keep time in mind. So that would be a key thing. Now let me another comment here about why did I choose 3? I said 3 principles. I pick this number, this seemingly arbitrary number 3. Anti-patterns. If you give me one thing that is a principle, how do you manage engineers? Well, I make sure to really be a strong communicator, and we make sure to communicate in documents, and you talk about one thing, right? And that's your entire response. This once again that gives me a signal of possibly a signal lack of breadth, lack of
Yeah.
experience. Like it's a one year very focused on one thing. The other end of that spectrum, of course, anti-pattern, is you listing off the
Yeah.
10 Project Oxygen principles, right? Or even saying, hey, there's three things. Oh, and another thing I do is I also wind up, and oh, and the other thing, right? And you keep going on. So that's
Yeah.
why I say pick three. It's just a reasonable number. If you pick
Yeah.
two, fine. If you pick four, fine. But just be clear about that and kind of
Yeah.
stick to that. So, all right, I think that's the skill set section. I think that's what I've got to say there. Might remember some things.
Great. Yeah, great. That's really good, really useful. So we've done stories, we've done skill sets.
Yep.
For the third S, scenario.
Yeah, I did pick S's there for that, didn't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, so scenarios. So again, like Google likes to do these. These are, I would consider like a hypothetical kind of a
Yeah.
question. An example, I think I gave an example already. A team manager abruptly left, you're taking over. How would you approach it? You know, maybe maybe it's a story that you know that doesn't really apply to you, and that's so again, like maybe you've been asked a story question. Tell me about a time where you had to help manage someone out who wasn't in your reporting chain, and that just is not an experience that you've dealt with. Then you could offer that as a hypothetical and say, hey, well, I haven't experienced that, but I could see myself doing that and being involved in that. I could talk you through how I might do it. Right? Then again, this is opt-in. You're offering that to the interviewer. So again, system design with people is one way to kind of think about this. And so you may not get one of these questions because, again, like Google for some reason likes to do these, or at least that's been my experience. Others maybe not as much. But again, I think it's a good option for the stories that don't apply. So it's maybe more for you than it is for the interviewer. Okay, I want to talk about a trap, a pitfall, a danger
Okay.
situation here with these questions. And it happens, I would say, uh, 70, three-quarters of the time when I ask a hypothetical question in my coaching sessions. This happens.
Wow. Okay.
Is that people, and it's just a natural thing, is that I'll say, and I'll use the example again. You have a team whose managers left abruptly, and your task taking over that team, get them back on track. Our brains automatically go, oh, I've experienced this exact thing before. Let me tell you about that. What happened was, and now what you've just done by starting that and letting your brain do that and take over is you've just switched from a hypothetical question, scenario-based question, to a story question. And you've just pulled the interviewer, like again, this cognitive dissonance. They're trying to get a signals about how you approach situations, and what you're doing is you're telling them a story instead. So that's a very tempting thing to do, and our brains just naturally do that. And the things I would say is, first off, it's highly unlikely, I should say highly unlikely. It's unlikely that your story is truly exactly in the same space as the hypothetical question. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And the second thing is that uh, you may uh, you may actually not even realize. Let me think about what I'm trying to say. Now I need to collect my thoughts here. Let me think about what I'm trying to say here. The experience that you have is likely not going to illustrate or even get to the point, into the space that the interviewer is after. So it's something it's just something that happens with our brains. It's a human psychology thing that we naturally sort of connect things, patterns, and see this thing. And so it's just a really good chance that it's not what the interviewer's after. So the thing you could do is, of course, you can offer to the interviewer. You can say, "Well, I've had something very similar, like what you're describing, happen to me. I could tell you about that if you like." Again, the opt-in approach, and I would use an opt-in approach here because the interviewer is like thinking about this space here. So if the interviewer says, "Okay, sure, why don't you go ahead and tell me?" Right? Then that's allowing you to go ahead and tell the story. But they may not want that, right? They may really be trying to get you to talk about this like as a system designer or a hypothetical. So resist the urge to just dive in without checking is really that's a very long-winded way of saying that. But uh, definitely in this hypothetical type of question, you want to draw on your experience, on your tool belt to kind of describe how you might approach this situation. You're not going to solve it. You likely don't have a recipe because every situation, it's humans, it's messy, it's complex, it's going to be different. But you can talk about your approach that you might take. So in the scenario of the the managers left abruptly, you've been tasked with taking over the team, get them back on track. Maybe I would say, well, I'm going to make an assumption that the team's morale was low already, and not because the manager left. I'm going to go ahead and make that assumption because usually that doesn't happen that quickly. And maybe their morale was low because of productivity. I'm not really sure, but let's assume that if that's okay. Then one of the things that I might need to do is, with stuff like that, when morale is low, that's a very emotional thing that's going to take time to turn around. So I might need to buy time. I mean, it might need to talk to my manager and just say, look, we're going to need to do a reset. I need some time. We're going to take just 2 weeks or a week to kind of reset. I need to understand what's going on. I need the time. So I might do that. So I'm not giving you a sort of, again, there's no recipe here. I'm just saying this is maybe how I would think through it. And so the mix of these opt-in, making some assumptions, and maybe some different approaches, things you might try, and if that didn't work, that's, I think, how you want to approach this. It's a little bit like a system design, except there's no right answer really. I mean, there's different approaches that you might be able to take, but be creative. Come up with some creative ideas. I might the first thing I might just do is I might just go into the team space or on Zoom and say, hey, whoever wants to meet, I want to be here to listen. Let's just go and why don't we go bowling? I'm making that up, but be creative. And maybe that's not creative. Some people might say that's not creative, Mark. There's probably much more creative things you can do. So I'm sure there are, and I would encourage that, right? Okay.
Yeah, I love bowling. Cool. Yeah, I think just going back to that trap again. Because I guess there's a reason they ask sometimes behavioral or story questions, and there's a reason sometimes they ask hypothetical. They're looking for different things from each. So yeah, it makes sense to respect that and not to just crowbar in a story when they're asking for a hypothetical. So yeah, I think that's important advice.
And I think one of the signals that you can provide in a hypothetical situation is you can provide a signal that you have the I hate to say courage, but you have the ability to go beyond the book. That you don't just run things by the book. You can if there's something that's ambiguous in an organizational space or a team space, you're willing to jump in and try some things out and experiment with that. And that's part of why an interviewer would want to give a hire a thumbs up. Like that would be a good signal. So.
Okay.
One last comment around the be creative here, and it's related also in the stories to having an interesting, messy story, and I think it's in the context of the skill set questions around anecdotally illustrating your points. One of the facts of interviewing, especially interviewers in large companies, is they typically there's an interviewing pool, and interviewers will do multiple interviews in a week.
Yeah.
So there is a chance that they don't get around to finishing up their write-up on their interview feedback until the next day or the day after. Yeah. And sometimes we've had to be on people that took even longer than that. So what does that mean? That means that the more memorable your responses are, the more kind of unique, I'll say, your responses are, the more likely it is that the interviewer is going to remember that, and it'll be that's a set you apart kind of a signal. Now, there could be things that you do that are set you apart in a bad way, of course, that can happen. But I think if you have show creativity, if you have aspects of your stories that are really kind of, this didn't really work out too well, and then we kind of got together and we had a good laugh about it, when we all fell in the pool together after that event. That's just something that is more likely to be memorable. So that's part of I think what you want to do. You want to show yourself as an individual, as someone who stands out in your responses.
I like that sort of little splashes of maybe little colorful details without going too far, just to try to kind of just to put yourself across and make sure they remember you. Yeah. Rather than just being another kind of gray engineer.
Yeah, I think that's useful. I mean, every person is going to have that, and the key here isn't that candidates don't have that. They have had these interesting experiences. They have the way to do that. You just need to do it in the interview. And again, it's
Yeah.
this awkward 40 minute long compressed thing, and so prep for that. That's worth prepping for.
Yeah, yeah, and I think a lot of candidates kind of, maybe there's some aspect where people think, oh, I'm not going to prepare too much because I want to show them, I just want to be me. But actually, the more you prepare in some ways, then you're freer to be you, because you don't have, your mind doesn't have to work at 100 miles an hour trying to think of something to say. You know what you more or less what you're going to say. You've got the experiences there in the back of your mind to draw from, and you can kind of just relax a bit more and be yourself. So I think actually, like, the more you prepare, the more yourself you can be in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think if you prepare and you rehearse, then your brain, your mental capacity during the interview allows you to illustrate and be more engaging versus having to try and remember things, right? Because you've practiced.
Exactly.
Anyway, yeah. I'm just repeating what you're saying. I think it's a really good point, Tom.
Cool. All right. I feel like we've come to the end. Is there anything else you wanted to leave people with before we sign off?
Yeah, I guess I would say yes. So yes, there are just one or two things. One of them is just to be intentional about this, and this is consistent with what you just said about preparing. Spend the time to prep, and especially the stories. Those are the things you can do, and practice. And practicing with coaches is great because we can of course give you feedback based on lots of experience. But I think even practicing yourself, record yourself on video, watch yourself. That can be very enlightening. If you have friends that are willing to listen to you tell a story or things like that, that can be helpful too. So be intentional. Spend the time. I think the investment is worth the time. So that's one thing I would say. And then back to the thing about stay close to the type of question. I think I mentioned that earlier. And then I also mentioned earlier this notion about give yourself a little bit of grace. Like it's part of this process is I don't want to say failing, but kind of fumbling around a little bit as you're practicing this and as you're exercising this muscle of interviewing that you maybe don't exercise all the time. And so just recognize that that's a different muscle, and it is going to feel awkward, and you're going to fumble a little bit, and it's not going to feel great, but it will definitely, I think it will definitely help you. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think practice is just so helpful. Obviously, mock interviews are great if you can do it with an expert like yourself. Then I got an offer. Hopefully, then do it with us. But even if you don't, even if it's just practicing even out loud on your own, but out loud is better than not speaking out loud. And then the next step with friends or whoever, even you're a colleague who you have the trust of, or practicing is just going to make such a difference. So I definitely recommend that, even if it's not mock interviews with an expert on IGotAnOffer, which hopefully for some of you watching it will be. Mark, thanks so much. Packed full of useful stuff, and it's always great to have you on. So thanks a lot, and we'll hope to have you on the channel again soon.
Great. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.
Hello. Really hope you found that useful. If you did, you can like and subscribe. And why not come visit us at IGotAnOffer.com. There you can find more videos, useful frameworks, and question guides, all completely free. And you can also book expert feedback one-to-one with our coaches from Google, Meta, Amazon, etc. Thank you, and good luck with your interview.